Welcome to the third lecture in our series on Pauline Chronology. In the previous video, we constructed a timeline of Paul's visits to Jerusalem based on his letters. In this lecture, we will seek to construct a timeline of Paul's visits to Jerusalem based on the information in Acts. Once again, the relevant scriptures for this task from the NASB can be found on the accompanying handout. We'll begin our timeline with the famous Damascus Road encounter in Acts 9, 21-25. I'll read a few relevant excerpts. Saul was approaching Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice. They brought him into Damascus, and he was 3 days without sight. Now for several days after his sight was restored, he was with the disciples who were at Damascus. Saul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived at Damascus. And when many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him. But his disciples let him down through an opening in the wall. So we start our timeline with Christ's appearance to Paul, after which, according to the text, Paul goes to Damascus, where he remains for, quote, many days, unquote, Acts 9:23, before he has to escape from the Jews by being lowered in a basket through an opening in the city wall. We can then pick up Paul's story in Acts 9:26-30. And when he had come to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles, and described to them how he had seen the Lord on the road. And he was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, talking and arguing with the Hellenistic Jews, but they were attempting to put him to death. But when the brethren learned of it, they brought him down to Caesarea and sent him away to Tarsus. Mapping this information on our timeline will show that, upon escaping Damascus, Paul makes his way to Jerusalem for his first post-encounter visit. During this visit, he receives help from Barnabas and sees the apostles. He also manages to offend enough Jews with his zealous advocacy of the gospel that the Jerusalem church decides it is best to send Paul back home to Tarsus, which, of course, is in the province of Cilicia. The next time we hear of Paul is in Acts 11:25-30, followed by 12:25. And Barnabas left for Tarsus to look for Saul, and he brought him to Antioch. And it came about that for an entire year they met with the church. Now at this time some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world. Each of them determined to send a contribution for the relief of the brethren living in Judea, and this they did, sending it in charge of Barnabas and Saul. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had fulfilled their mission. Here we see Barnabas bringing Paul from Tarsus to Antioch, which is in the province of Syria, where he spends a year teaching his fellow believers. At the end of that year, Agabus arrives with his prediction of a famine. The taking of famine relief funds to Jerusalem then constitutes Paul's second post-encounter visit to the Holy City. Of note, Paul again goes to Jerusalem with Barnabas. He goes because of Agabus's revelation, and the purpose of the visit is famine relief. When would this visit have taken place? Luke provides us some absolute dating information when he notes in Acts 11:28 that this prophesied famine occurred during the time of Emperor Claudius, who reigned from 41 to 54 CE. Such dating fits well with the intervening description in Acts 12:1-24 of the activities and death of King Herod Agrippa I, who ruled Judea from 41 CE to March of 44, when he died a horrific, painful death. We also know from Josephus that Judea experienced famine under procurators Crispus Fadus, 44-46, and Tiberius Alexander, 46-48. All of these dates would then suggest that Agabus's prophecy occurred sometime in 43 or early 44. Now following this visit, Paul and Barnabas embark on what is now commonly identified as Paul's first missionary journey, during which they visit Cyprus and South Galatia. As you may remember, it is on Cyprus that Paul converts the proconsul Sergius Paulus, his highest-ranking convert as far as we know. Other sources also inform us that the Sergi family, from which Sergius Paulus hails, was from South Galatia, so it is probably no coincidence that when Paul and Barnabas leave Cyprus, they head straight for South Galatia, probably with glowing letters of introduction. It's these kind of connections and details that give Luke's account its verisimilitude, its whiff of authenticity. Paul eventually makes his way back to Jerusalem in Acts 15. Again, I will read the relevant excerpts. And some men came down to Antioch from Judea and began teaching circumcision. And when Paul and Barnabas had great dissension and debate with them, it was determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders concerning this issue. And when they arrived at Jerusalem, they reported all that God had done with them among the Gentiles. Then it seemed good to the apostles and the elders, with the whole church, to choose men from among them to send to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, Judas called Barsabbas, and Silas. This passage describes the great Jerusalem Council. Paul again goes with Barnabas, and the Gentile status constitutes the key issue. Paul and Barnabas return to Antioch with Silas. They decide to revisit the churches they had planted, but they disagree over whether or not John Mark should accompany them. Paul insists that he should not, since he had abandoned them on their first journey. Barnabas is equally adamant about giving him another shot. The disagreement is so sharp that the two split, and Paul ends up going on his second missionary journey with Silas. They evangelize Macedonia and Achaia before returning to Judea via Ephesus. The Jews at Ephesus want Paul to stay so that they can continue hearing about his gospel, Acts 18:20. But Paul curiously insists that he must instead continue on. Acts 18:22 then tells us, "And when he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church and went down to Antioch." The text doesn't actually say that he went up to Jerusalem, only that he went up. But since one always goes up to Jerusalem, most scholars accept that Luke here has another Jerusalem visit in view. But what is the purpose of this visit? The text says only that Paul greeted the church. He then moves on to Antioch before returning to Ephesus in Asia as part of his third missionary journey. Knox will press the awkwardness of this return to Ephesus. What was so pressing about greeting the church in Jerusalem that Paul couldn't have just stayed in Ephesus during his former visit? Whatever the reason, this time Paul stays in Ephesus for 2 years, Acts 19:10, after which he decides to return to Macedonia and Achaia before heading back to Jerusalem and from there going on to Rome, Acts 19:21. This final trip to Jerusalem in Acts plays out over Acts 21 to 23. "And after these days we got ready and started on our way up to Jerusalem. And when we had come to Jerusalem, the church received us gladly. The Jews from Asia, upon seeing Paul in the temple, began to stir up all the multitude. Then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, and the next day to Caesarea." In describing his motivation for this visit, Paul will later say in Acts 24:17, "Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation." This mention of alms seems to correlate with the collection that Paul mentions in the Corinthian and Roman correspondence, although it receives no other mention in Acts. We can thus conclude our Acts-based timeline in this way. In Paul's final Jerusalem visit, he claims to have brought alms to his nation, and he is arrested. After a lengthy imprisonment and a treacherous journey, he does eventually make it to Rome, where Acts leaves him at its close. In the final video lecture on Pauline Chronology, we will consider how this timeline compares to the timeline that we constructed from Paul's letters.